Okay, Mr. Watson here, and in this video we're going to be talking about blood and exercise. And specifically what we're going to talk about is how the blood is transported, okay? And then we're going to talk about how blood velocity and blood pressure changes during exercise, okay? So let's give it a go. So let's start with the transportation of oxygen. So we've been talking about pulmonary circuits, pathway of blood, systemic circuit, conduction system, all of this blood moving, that the heart rate, venous return, all of this. But ultimately it's all about this demand for oxygen. And ultimately we need to know how oxygen is transported within the blood. Okay? Now, just for context here, blood is around, and as you can see, a huge red blood cell on the screen there. Blood is approximately 45% of cells, okay? And around 55% of the blood is plasma, okay? And oxygen is, as we know, is essential, especially for living and exercise becomes more essential, and it's carried a lot in the bloodstream. So we're just going to look at how it's transported, okay? So here we have some oxygen, and oxygen can be transported in two ways. Now the first way is it is dissolved within blood plasma, but it's a very small amount. Again, these amounts can differ around 3%. A very small, but the concept here is we're understanding a small amount of of oxygen, is dissolved in blood plasma. Okay, a very small amount. The majority, and as you can guess from that diagram, is the majority is transported within the red blood cells. Okay, so the majority of these oxygen molecules are transported via red blood cells. Okay, but there's a specific way within the red blood cells we must be aware of. Now, within the red blood cells, we have something called hemoglobin. Okay. And what happens is this hemoglobin has an affinity for oxygen. It likes oxygen. So oxygen binds to this hemoglobin to form oxyhemoglobin. So that's a key word there. Okay. So oxygen has an affinity for hemoglobin. It binds to the hemoglobin and forms oxyhemoglobin. Okay. Now, when the hemoglobin is fully saturated, it can actually carry 4 molecules of oxygen. So it doesn't always do that, but when it's fully saturated, one hemoglobin can carry 4 molecules of oxygen. So that binding is called oxyhemoglobin. And these are the two ways oxygen is transported in the blood, carried in the bloodstream. Okay, so could also call it gas transport. Obviously, oxygen being an essential gas. Okay. Now, before we move on to the transportation of carbon dioxide, a common exam question asks you to compare hemoglobin and myoglobin. So your hemoglobin points here are right there, is oxygen binds with it in the red blood cell. Once it binds, it forms oxyhemoglobin, and when fully saturated, it can carry 4. But we also have the storage of oxygen in myoglobin, and myoglobin is generally found in the muscles and in the cardiac muscle, the heart. Okay, and myoglobin has a higher affinity for oxygen, basically likes oxygen, and one of the comparisons is it has a higher affinity than hemoglobin. So it's a nice point to make in an exam question which asks you to compare. But let's look at what myoglobin does. And myoglobin stores the oxygen in the muscles, and it does transport it to the mitochondria. And the mitochondria is where aerobic respiration takes place. It's the site for aerobic respiration, something we talk about a lot, the mitochondria in A2 during energy systems and Krebs cycle, etc., etc. But for now, our main differences between hemoglobin and myoglobin is the myoglobin essentially can store oxygen in muscles, where hemoglobin will transport in red blood cells through oxyhemoglobin. Okay, but the myoglobin can transport it to the mitochondria for aerobic respiration, and mitochondria has a higher affinity than hemoglobin. But moving on, let's look at the transportation of carbon dioxide. Now, the big difference here is carbon dioxide can be transported in 3 ways. And as we know, carbon dioxide is the waste product of aerobic energy production, and it must be removed in gaseous exchange. Okay, so let's look how it's transported though in the blood cells. Okay, and then it will be removed. So we have CO2 in the muscle, and just like oxygen, a small percentage of CO2 is dissolved in blood plasma, around 7%, but we don't need to get hung up on the percentages. We just need to understand, so the smallest amount of CO2 is dissolved in blood plasma and transported that way. The next way is within hemoglobin, just like oxygen, but not near as much. Around 23% of carbon dioxide will bind with hemoglobin to form carbaminohemoglobin. Okay, so around 23% of carbon dioxide is transported as carbaminohemoglobin. So within hemoglobin. So again, we have that binding with hemoglobin, and we get carbaminohemoglobin. But the majority of carbon dioxide is dissolved in water. Okay, and this can happen also in the plasma, I must say, but I don't want to spend too long on this section. But what happens is the carbon dioxide is dissolved in water and carried as something we call carbonic acid. So approximately 70% of blood is transported as carbonic acid. And this acid, carbonic acid, is then broken down and we get bicarbonate. But really, we can know it as 3 main ways of transportation. The smallest amount dissolved in blood plasma, around 23% as carbaminohemoglobin, and around 70% as carbonic acid. And that carbonic acid being the major difference to the transportation of oxygen. What we're going to do now is we're going to look at how blood velocity and blood pressure changes during exercise. And we're going to start with blood velocity. And what velocity means is the rate of displacement, the displacement of blood. Okay. So we're exercising. We're going to focus on the systemic circuit system because we're interested in the blood going to oxygenated blood going to the muscles via the aorta. Okay. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to break it down into some key points here about velocity. Now, blood velocity is highest in the arteries. So you can see there the blood is in the aorta. Now, why is blood velocity highest in the arteries? Well, it's just been ejected, and hopefully forcefully due to Starling's law, etc., contraction. So when it's ejected during systole, linking to the cardiac cycle there, that's why the blood velocity is its highest. Okay, we also so it's traveling there at its highest point because it's just been ejected. But there's also another reason why it's highest in the arteries. And that's because the cross-sectional area is small. It's all within the aorta. All of that blood is in the main artery. Okay, so all of that blood is being displaced together and it's going down that narrow lumen in a small cross-sectional area. Now, as we can see there, the blood, and if we remember from the systemic circuit system, the blood's about to enter the arterioles. And we know that the blood goes to different locations. Now we know about the vascular shunt. So blood velocity reduces. It reduces as it passes through the arterioles and the capillaries. Okay, why does it reduce? Well, the cross-sectional area has just increased. It's no longer all in the artery. And one way of trying to picture this is if you think about a watering can, right? If you were to take off the end part of the watering can, the water would just fall out rapidly. Okay, it's just all in one place. The velocity would be high. But if you had on the end that sprinkler, the water is then displaced via different holes. And this is how you can imagine the arterioles. Okay, we get a larger cross-sectional area, and that cross-sectional area will decrease the blood velocity. So that water, if you like, coming out the watering can is happening slower. Okay, because obviously you'll flood your plant if you don't have that sprinkling part on. So that's an interesting way to do. So the cross-sectional area has increased. So if we look there, the blood has increased and it's now going through the arterioles and into the capillaries. Now, as we know, the function of capillaries is to slow the blood down for gaseous exchange. So that means during gaseous exchange, blood velocity is still low. It's decreasing because gaseous exchange is occurring. But hopefully we're getting the idea here. So then the blood is in the venules and it's still at a lower blood velocity because we have a larger cross-sectional area. But we're heading to the vein. Okay, so we've got a large cross-sectional area through the venules. Okay, so the velocity is still low or decreasing. But then it all gets back to the vein. And the blood ends up in one place again. Now, what we know is the blood in the vena cava traveling back to the right atrium is largely against gravity and it's slow moving. But we have mechanisms, venous return mechanisms, to speed up the blood velocity. So blood velocity increases as it meets again in the vein due to their mechanisms. Okay? So meets again and back to the right atrium. So we had a little increase in the velocity there due to the venous return mechanisms. So our key points about velocity here are it's the highest in the arteries. Why? Well, during systole, we have forceful contractions. Okay? The cross-sectional area is smaller as it's all in the main artery. As it gets to the arterioles, we have a larger cross-sectional area, so then that means blood velocity decreases in the arterioles, just like it does in the capillaries because of gaseous exchange. It slows the blood flow. It's still low in the venules because we have a large cross-sectional area, okay? But then it increases again in the vena cava because it's back together in the main vein, okay? And it's helped through venous return mechanisms. So hopefully that explains blood velocity and exercise in the systemic circuit system there. Okay? And finally we have blood pressure. Now I'm going to do my best to explain this one. Okay, because it can be a little bit complicated, but hopefully I can make it simple. So first of all, what do we mean by blood pressure? So blood pressure is the amount of force your blood puts on the walls of the arteries. Okay, so the amount of force on the walls of the arteries, the higher the blood pressure, the higher if there's more force. But blood pressure does have a formula, and I'm going to present this formula in the hope to make this explanation simpler. So blood pressure equals cardiac output times peripheral resistance. Now don't panic with peripheral resistance, we'll come on to that in a moment. Okay, it does have other names in other videos, but in the mark scheme of Cambridge it references peripheral resistance, so that's what we're knowing it as. Let's go back to blood pressure. Now, you may have had your blood pressure or should have had your blood pressure taken at some point at the doctor's, and what happens is you get two readings. So here's a reading, an average blood pressure reading at rest, and it's 120/80 millimeters of mercury, but we're going to leave that out. Now that top number is higher than the bottom, and we can link this to the cardiac cycle. So that 120 is our systolic blood pressure. So the pressure during systole, when we've just had, when we're having contractions. Okay. The 80 is obviously the diastolic phase, when the heart is relaxing, when the ventricles and atria are filling. Okay, so 120/80. So we're going to look at how them numbers change during exercise and why they change. Let's focus on cardiac output. What is cardiac output? We should know. Heart rate times stroke volume. Okay, so let's start with heart rate. Let's even link it to the cardiac control center. Okay, the cardiac control center will send, or if we're exercising, let's focus on exercise. Okay, blood pressure during exercise. The cardiac control center, via the accelerator nerve, the sympathetic nervous system, will determine this firing rate of the SA node, which will go onto the vascular shunt, which we'll come on to in a moment. But let's go back to that heart rate. So the information from the brain, now we're exercising. So chemoreceptors are like increased CO2, baroreceptors, increased stretch on walls, etc., etc., release of adrenaline, etc., etc. Okay? So what happens is we have an increase in the firing of the SA node. That means the heart is contracting faster. That means we have an increase in heart rate. So as we're exercising, this is what happens. So we'll put a nice arrow on our formula there, up by the blood pressure formula. So when we exercise, we already know, okay, we have receptors via sensory nerves, give information to the brain. Brain goes, right, let's get this SA node firing. Higher contraction, higher heart rate. So let's put an arrow there. Now, if it's contracting more, and as we know, when we exercise, we have an increase in venous return, which, increase in elasticity, increased force of contraction. Now, as we know, let's be careful. We know stroke volume will plateau during exercise, but we do have an increase. We do have an initial increase, and as we can see from the heart rate, more forceful contractions. So contractility increases, meaning stroke volume increases. So already on half of this formula, we've got an increase. And blood pressure equals cardiac output times peripheral resistance. So we've already got an increase on half. Okay? Hopefully we should know that, because that's not new knowledge there. Now let's take a look at peripheral resistance. What do we mean by this? Okay, and sorry there, cardiac output will go up as a result of heart rate and stroke volume due to that relationship. Peripheral resistance. If we look at this diagram here, and we specifically focus on them red blood cells there, the blood is very close to the walls of that vessel, okay, that artery. And that means it's adding resistance. That is the peripheral resistance. It's putting force on them walls right there. Okay, and that's due to the small cross section, that narrow lumen. So when these arterioles constrict, it increases the peripheral resistance. Now let's take a look at the opposite. When we dilate, there's less peripheral resistance. If you look, there's a lot less pressure, a lot less force on the walls of the arteriole when it's dilating, because we have a larger cross section. The lumen is wider, it's dilating. Now let's link this to the vascular shunt. So if we go back to the bottom there, you'll see the diagram I've created, that red representing the blood flow out of the aorta. Okay, we know when we exercise, we want the majority of the blood going to the muscles, and if it's intent, up to 88%. That means a lot of the precapillary sphincters start to constrict, and they limit the blood flow to the organs. So the skin, the kidneys, the liver, the gut, and the brain, the coronary will maintain it, but the rest of it has its blood supply limited. And how does it do that? Well, it constricts. And if you look at the peripheral resistance diagram there, when they constrict, they have a smaller cross section. They narrow that lumen, okay? And that increases the peripheral resistance. Okay, the blood going to the muscles is dilating, so the peripheral resistance is decreased. But we have an increase in peripheral resistance at some of our arterioles and precapillary sphincters, okay? So now when we look at it like this, of the blood pressure formula, we'd have an increase in cardiac output due to the increase in heart rate and stroke volume. And we now have an increase in some peripheral resistance of our blood vessels, the arterioles and the precapillary sphincters. So what happens? We get an increase in blood pressure when we exercise. And I've put an example of a reading there that it can get us up to as high as 170 on our systolic blood pressure. Now, what you also should notice is the diastolic hasn't changed. And the point here is that there is little to no change in the diastolic blood pressure. Okay? Because once we go to maximal exercise, anyway, as we know, we limit Starling's law. So we're not looking to maximize the filling. We just get to that point and we have to keep going. Heart rate takes us the rest of the way. Okay? But as you can see that during exercise, blood pressure increases. Now, rather than just teach it to the mark scheme, that's why I've tried to give you the why right there. But to summarize, I'm going to give you the answers that are accepted on why does blood pressure increase during exercise. Well, the reason it increases is cardiac output increases because we had an increase in heart rate, and initially we had an increase in stroke volume before it plateaued. We have stronger contractions and increased ejection fraction. Now, increased ejection fraction, if we remember, we're looking for a higher percentage of blood to be ejected from the ventricles. Okay, and that comes from more forceful contractions. So we know that we have increased contractility. The SA node fires, we want forceful contractions. We've got more blood, let's eject it. Okay, increased venous return, more blood traveling back to the heart. It happens when we exercise. And then we have an increase in peripheral resistance. And I've added on blood viscosity there, if we remember the thickness of blood. Okay, and when the blood gets thicker, we have more pressure on the walls of that artery. So they're applying more force because the blood is thicker. It doesn't flow as well when it's thick. So that it adds on to the resistance. Okay, another long video, but there were some complicated ones to try and get your head around there. I hope I've done it in a simple way and I hope it helps. Thank you.